The roses in my grandmother's garden bloomed out of season, and that should have been my first warning. It was late October 2020 when I inherited the house in Millfield, Connecticut, a town so small it barely existed on most maps. The realtor had warned me about the property's peculiarities, but grief makes you ignore practical concerns. I needed solitude to process losing the only family I had left, and Grandma Rose's Victorian cottage seemed perfect for that. What I didn't expect was to find her prize-winning roses blooming in full crimson glory despite the first frost having killed everything else in town 3 weeks prior. They shouldn't have been alive, yet there they were, filling the October air with their summer sweetness, as if time itself had forgotten to touch this small corner of earth. I spent my first morning exploring the house, reacquainting myself with childhood memories. The place smelled like lavender sachets and old wood polish, exactly as I remembered from summer visits 30 years ago. Every room held ghosts of the past: the kitchen where Grandma Rose taught me to make pie crust, the reading nook where she told stories about our family's history. But it was the garden that truly unsettled me. I stood at the back door, coffee mug warming my hands, staring at rows of impossible roses. Red ones, white ones, pale pink climbers that should have withered months ago. The morning sun caught droplets of dew on their petals, making them sparkle like jewels. "Mrs. Hartwell?" I spun around. A woman stood at my garden gate, elderly with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. She wore a wool coat despite the mild weather, and her eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who missed nothing. "I'm Margaret Hartwell, yes." "And you are?" "Eleanor Hayes. I lived next door to your grandmother for 40 years. She stepped through the gate without invitation, her gaze fixed on the roses. "I see they're still blooming." "Yes, it's strange, isn't it? This late in the season." Eleanor's expression grew troubled. "Strange doesn't begin to cover it, dear. Those roses have been blooming continuously since your grandmother planted them in 1962. Never stopped, not once. Not for winter, not for drought, not even during the blizzard of '78 when everything else died." My coffee suddenly tasted bitter. "That's impossible, is it?" Eleanor moved closer to one of the red roses, but didn't touch it. "Your grandmother never told you about the garden? About why she chose this particular spot for her roses?" "She just said she loved gardening." Eleanor laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Rose Hartwell loved a lot of things, dear. But gardening wasn't one of them. Not until after the accident." "What accident?" But Eleanor was already backing toward the gate, her face pale. "Ask around town. People remember. Though most prefer not to talk about it." She paused at the gate. "Word of advice, Margaret. Don't dig in that garden. Some things are better left buried." She hurried away, leaving me alone with the impossible roses and a growing sense of unease. That afternoon, I drove into Millfield's tiny downtown, 3 blocks of weathered storefronts clustered around a village green. The library was housed in a converted church, all Gothic arches and stained glass windows that cast colored shadows across rows of old books. The librarian, a thin woman in her 60s, looked up as I approached her desk. "You must be Rose's granddaughter." "I'm Carol Manning. I was sorry to hear about your grandmother's passing." "Thank you. I'm trying to learn more about the house's history. Specifically about something that happened in 1962. "An accident?" Carol's expression shifted, becoming guarded. "What kind of accident?" "I'm not sure. A neighbor mentioned it, said it had something to do with my grandmother's garden." Carol was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming against her desk. Outside, autumn wind rattled the stained glass windows. "I was 16 in 1962, she finally said. Your grandmother had just married your grandfather, moved into that house. She was pregnant with your father." She paused, looking around the empty library as if checking for eavesdroppers. "The accident happened in November. Your grandmother was working in the backyard, preparing the soil for a garden. She was digging near the old oak tree when she found something." "Found what?" "Bodies, Margaret, 3 of them. Children. The temperature in the library seemed to drop 10 degrees. I could feel goosebumps rising on my arms. The police investigation revealed they'd been buried there decades earlier. The previous homeowner, a man named Jonathan Blackwood, had lived alone in that house from 1920 until his death in 1958. Neighbors always thought him odd, kept to himself. Turns out he'd been taking children. 3 kids who'd gone missing between 1925 and 1940. My hands were shaking. I gripped the edge of Carol's desk to steady myself. What happened to them? They were given proper burials in the town cemetery. But your grandmother, she never got over finding them. She blamed herself somehow, felt responsible for disturbing their rest. That's when she planted the roses. Said she wanted to create something beautiful where something terrible had happened. Carol leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. But Margaret, those children, people in town say they never really left. That they're still in that garden, somehow bound to it. And your grandmother, she spent 58 years tending to them, keeping them company. I left the library in a daze, Carol's words echoing in my mind. The drive home passed in a blur of autumn colors and darkening sky. By the time I pulled into the driveway, dusk was settling over the cottage like a gray blanket. The roses glowed softly in the fading light, more vibrant than any living flower had a right to be. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my grandmother's old bed, listening to the house settle around me. But underneath the normal creaks and sighs of old wood, I heard something else. Whispers. Soft voices drifting through my open window from the direction of the garden. At first, I told myself it was just the wind in the trees. But as I listened more carefully, I began to make out words. Children's voices, speaking in the formal manner of an earlier era. She's here, one voice said, high and sweet. The new lady is here. Do you think she'll tend to us like Grandma Rose did? This from a different child, younger sounding. We should introduce ourselves, said a third voice. It's only polite. I sat up in bed, my heart hammering. The voices were coming from directly below my window, from the heart of the rose garden. Hello, I called softly through the screen. Who's there? Silence for a moment. Then, she can hear us. The new lady can hear us. I pulled on my robe and slippers and crept downstairs. The back door stood slightly ajar, though I was certain I'd locked it. Cool night air drifted through the gap, carrying the scent of roses and something else, something that reminded me of playground dirt and childhood summers. I stepped onto the back porch. The garden was bathed in moonlight, and the roses seemed to pulse with their own inner luminescence. Near the center of the garden, close to where the old oak tree cast its shadow, I saw them. 3 children, translucent as morning mist, 2 boys and a girl, dressed in clothing from the 1920s and 1930s. They stood among the roses as if they'd grown there, as much a part of the garden as the flowers themselves. The oldest boy, perhaps 10 years old, stepped forward. His face was solemn but kind. Good evening, miss. I'm Thomas. This is Billy and Susan. He gestured to the younger boy and the girl. We lived here once. Long ago. Before the bad man came, Susan added, her voice barely a whisper. I should have been terrified. Should have run screaming back into the house. Instead, I found myself walking down the porch steps, drawn by something I couldn't name. You're the children who were. I couldn't finish the sentence. Buried here, Thomas said matter-of-factly. Yes, miss. But Grandma Rose planted her roses over us, and we've been part of the garden ever since. She took care of us, talked to us, made sure we were never lonely. But she's gone now, Billy said, his lower lip trembling. Who's going to take care of the garden? Who's going to remember us? I knelt among the roses, feeling their impossible warmth against my skin. Up close, I could see that the children weren't entirely solid, starlight showed through their forms, and when the wind blew, they rippled like reflections on water. I don't know anything about gardening, I said honestly. Susan stepped closer, her small hand almost touching my cheek. Grandma Rose didn't know either, at first. But she learned. She loved us, and love is the only fertilizer magic needs. Magic? Thomas nodded solemnly. The roses aren't just flowers, miss. They're made of memory and love and the promise that no child should be forgotten. As long as they bloom, we exist. As long as someone tends them, we have a home. Over the next few days, I found myself spending more and more time in the garden. The children appeared every evening at dusk, sharing stories of their lives and deaths, their decades spent in the liminal space between earth and sky. They told me about Jonathan Blackwood, the lonely man who'd stolen them away from their families. They told me about the darkness and fear of their final moments, and about the peace my grandmother's roses had brought them. She used to sit with us every morning, Susan said as we watched the sun rise over the garden. She'd drink her coffee and tell us about her day, about you and your father and all the family we never got to have. Sometimes she'd cry, Billy added. Especially after your grandfather died. But she said the garden was where sorrow turned into something beautiful. I was beginning to understand. My grandmother hadn't just been gardening, she'd been mothering. Caring for 3 children who'd been denied the chance to grow up, giving them the love and attention they'd lost. But there was something else, something darker that the children hadn't told me. On my 4th night in the house, Eleanor Hayes appeared at my back door. She looked haggard, older than when I'd first met her. You need to leave, she said without preamble. Pack your things and go back to wherever you came from. Why? Because they're getting stronger. The children. I can see them from my bedroom window now, clear as day. They've never been that solid before. I invited Eleanor in for tea, hoping to calm her obvious distress. We sat in my grandmother's kitchen while the kettle whistled on the stove. Your grandmother made a bargain, Eleanor said, wrapping her hands around her mug as if seeking warmth. When she found those bodies, when she learned what had happened to them, she felt guilty. Guilty for disturbing them, guilty for being alive when they were dead, guilty for having the family they'd been denied. What kind of bargain? Eleanor's eyes were haunted. She bound herself to them. Used some kind of ritual, something she found in old books about grief and redemption. The roses weren't just planted, they were consecrated. Fed with her blood, her tears, her life force. That's why they never die, Margaret. They're sustained by the living. My tea suddenly tasted like ash. You're saying my grandmother sacrificed herself? Not all at once. Little by little, over 58 years. Every day she spent in that garden, she gave them a piece of herself. By the end, she was more ghost than woman. The children kept her alive through pure will, but when her body finally gave out. Eleanor shuddered. She became part of the garden. Part of them. That's impossible. Is it? Look at yourself, Margaret. For days you've been here, and you're already pale as milk. Already talking to dead children like it's the most natural thing in the world. They're calling to you the same way they called to her. I stood and walked to the window. In the garden, the 3 children played among the roses, their laughter carrying on the night breeze. They looked more solid now, more real. And I realized with growing horror that Eleanor was right. I could feel something pulling at me, drawing me toward the garden with invisible threads. How do I stop it? Eleanor shook her head sadly. Your grandmother tried to break the bond once, about 10 years ago. She stopped visiting the garden, stopped caring for the roses. Within a week, the children began to fade. And as they faded, she grew weaker. It was killing her to deny them. So I'm trapped. Unless you're willing to let them die. Really die, this time. Let the roses wither and the children pass on to whatever comes after. I thought about Thomas, Billy, and Susan. About their kindness, their loneliness, their desperate need for connection. About my grandmother, who'd spent her life caring for children who weren't her own, children who'd been murdered by a monster. About the choice I now faced. That night, I made my decision. I waited until the children appeared at their usual time, materializing among the roses like flowers blooming in reverse. They seemed more solid than ever, their faces bright with hope and affection. Hello, Margaret, Thomas said. We wondered if you might read to us tonight. Grandma Rose used to read us stories. I'd brought a book with me, a collection of fairy tales that had belonged to my grandmother. But instead of opening it, I set it aside and knelt among the roses. "I need to tell you something," I said. "About what happens next." The children gathered around me, their faces expectant. In the moonlight, they looked so alive, so present, that it was hard to believe they were spirits held together by magic and memory. "You can't stay here forever," I said gently. "And I can't take my grandmother's place." Susan's face crumpled. "But who will care for us? Who will remember us?" "I will. But not like this." I reached out and touched Susan's cheek. My hand passed through her face like mist, but I could feel the echo of warmth, the ghost of the child she'd once been. "You deserve to rest. To move on. To find the peace you've been denied." "We're not ready," Billy whispered. "We're scared." "I know. But being scared doesn't mean you can't be brave." Thomas, the eldest, studied my face with eyes that held far too much wisdom for a 10-year-old. "You're going to destroy the garden, aren't you? Let the roses die?" "Yes." "And us with them?" "I hope not. I hope you'll find something better. Something that doesn't require someone else to sacrifice their life for your existence." The children were quiet for a long moment. Around us, the roses rustled in a breeze I couldn't feel. Finally, Thomas nodded. "Grandma Rose gave us 58 years we shouldn't have had. Maybe that's enough." "Will you help me?" I asked. Susan took my hand, her small fingers like ice-cold silk. "What do we need to do?" I pulled out the folding shovel I'd found in my grandmother's shed. "We need to find the original binding. The place where she made her bargain." We searched the garden until we found it, a stone buried beneath the largest rose bush, covered in symbols I didn't recognize but somehow understood. The stone was stained dark with what I hoped was earth but suspected was something else entirely. "This is where it started," Thomas said. "Where Grandma Rose made her promise." I raised the shovel, then hesitated. "Are you sure? Once I break this, there's no going back." The children looked at each other, some silent communication passing between them. Then Susan stepped forward. "We're sure," she said. "We've been holding on for so long, but we're tired. We want to see what comes next." I brought the shovel down on the stone. It cracked with a sound like thunder, and the roses throughout the garden began to wither. The children flickered, their forms becoming more translucent. "Thank you," Thomas whispered as he faded. "For caring enough to let us go. Tell our families we remember them," Billy added, his voice growing distant. Susan was the last to fade. "The garden was beautiful," she said. "But you're right. It's time for something new to grow here." And then they were gone. I spent the rest of that night in the garden, watching the roses die. By dawn, nothing remained but withered stems and scattered petals. The magic that had sustained them for 58 years was broken, and without it, they crumbled to dust. Eleanor found me there in the morning, sitting among the dead flowers with tears streaming down my face. "It's done?" she asked. I nodded. "They're free. And you? How do you feel?" I considered the question. I felt empty, drained, as if something vital had been pulled out of me, but underneath the exhaustion was something else, a sense of lightness, of possibility. "Different," I said finally. "Like I can breathe again." Eleanor helped me to my feet. "What will you do now?" I looked at the barren garden, then at the house where my grandmother had lived and loved and sacrificed so much. "I'm going to plant something new. Not roses, they had their time. Something that grows naturally, something that doesn't require blood and magic to bloom." "And the children?" I could still feel their presence, faint but peaceful, like a whisper of gratitude on the morning breeze. "They're where they need to be now. Finally at rest." Over the next few weeks, I cleaned out the garden completely, removing every trace of the magical roses. In their place, I planted ordinary flowers, daisies, sunflowers, zinnias. Flowers that would bloom in their proper season and die when winter came, as nature intended. The house felt different too. Lighter somehow, as if a great weight had been lifted from its walls. I decided to stay through the winter, to give myself time to decide what came next. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, I thought I caught glimpses of movement in the garden. Not the children, they were truly gone, but something else. New spirits, perhaps, drawn by the peace that had settled over this small corner of earth. Or maybe just the play of light and shadow, the natural magic that exists everywhere if you know how to look for it. Either way, I no longer felt the need to tend impossible gardens or maintain unnatural bindings. I'd learned something my grandmother never had, that love doesn't require sacrifice, and sometimes the greatest kindness is knowing when to let go. The memory garden was gone, but the memories remained. And that, I realized, was exactly as it should be.